if she can, and I'm going to give you, while she's doing that, a little bit of an introduction. I have known Gillian Bowser for a very long time. It's probably been, oh my God, Gillian, I don't even want to say it. It's probably been about 30 years.
You didn't have to say that.
Well, you know, you were only 10 at the time.
Exactly.
Yeah. But Gillian is a really special person to me. She's also a research scientist in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Sustainability, where she's an associate professor at Colorado State University. Her research focuses on ecological indicators of climate change, specifically in Brazil and Peru, but also she's doing work, of course, around the area that she lives in now in Colorado, the Rocky Mountains. She looks at the linkages between changing ecological conditions, local community livelihoods, and climate. And she has worked as a wildlife biologist and ecologist for the U.S. National Park Service in Yellowstone, Grand Tetons, Joshua Tree, and other places for the Park Service. She helped establish in 2010 the Rocky Mountain Sustainability and Science Network, which was funded from the National Science Foundation. She still serves on the board of that network. And she has participated in the UN Framework and Climate Change Convention and the UN Global Environmental Outlook. She received the Commitment to Human Diversity and Ecology Award from the Ecological Society of America a couple of years ago. And a couple of things that you should know about Gillian is she is a fantastic baker as well as cook. And, you know, I really miss her from our weekly lab meetings that we used to have back at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, when she was in her PhD program. So with that, I'm just gonna turn it over to Gillian. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Betty, for that wonderful introduction. Yeah, I forgot about those amazing lab meetings where we'd have potlucks from 14 different countries or something crazy to try and figure out who could bake the best. So thank you all for this wonderful opportunity. And it really is great to reconnect with a lot of folks. And it's fun, you know, because Betty was my PhD advisor, but also to see Miguel online, who was a student with us at the Rocky Mountain Sustainable and Science Network, who won class 1. And then to also see Daniel online, who's in class 11 from that same network. So it's a pretty neat to see that thing. But what I'm going to talk about today is, you know, just sort of more of a conversation about being Black in nature. I think the timing that's going on right now is just important for us all to think about things and maybe think about things a little bit different when we talk about issues of diversity. So I just want to start to share some acknowledgements, and it's certainly something I'm very proud of, which is my own mother. And the reason why I want to share this acknowledgement, you know, is that this issue of identities and thinking about how we identify in our science field is just so important. And it's not, you know, where we started or what degrees we have. It's, you know, what is our passion, where do we go, and how do we take that to the broader audience? And my mother certainly exemplifies that as someone who never graduated from high school and now has her lifetime work exhibited at the National Museum of African American History and Culture of the Smithsonian. So it's just pretty amazing. So our discussion here today is sort of about being a Black female ecologist and diversifying the biosciences. And I think I'll probably interchangeably use the term bioscience plus earth sciences, ecology, environmental sciences, because unfortunately, in the sense of diversifying, all of those sciences are almost in the exact same place, in that their diversity numbers are incredibly low, and we need to think about why that occurs. So I'd love to start off with this, you know, because I'm a Black kid from Brooklyn, so it's important to start with that urban setting in the background. And I do have to admit that I did let my Ranger Rick card expire. It's a little bit expired, almost as expired since I knew Betty. No, not quite that long, But I think it's important because we think about things from where people are, and we associate that identity, and we inadvertently, I think, make barriers to why people participate in something like the biodiverse sciences or biodiversity or biosciences. So one good example is simply this address on this card from Brooklyn, New York. I mean, one of the most common mantras is, how do urban people get connected with nature or understand biodiversity? And yet here is this reach back that has going on for many, many generations on connecting people with nature and outdoors. So a quick sort of summary of myself of being Black from Brooklyn, to say that, you know, as a National Park Service ecologist for, as Betty mentioned, for over 20 years at 8 different parks. This picture is from Joshua Tree National Park. I've literally studied everything from bison to butterflies to desert tortoises, and with Betty it was prairie dogs, so it was a little bit of literally everything. But I actually transferred from being a federal biologist when I was at Texas A&M University, which has a cooperative ecosystem studies unit. So you have federal biologists sitting on a university campus, which gives you that sort of interchange between academic and federal life. And then I took a rather wacky sidestep to assistant dean, which turned out to be a rather bad idea. But now I'm an associate professor and researcher at Colorado State with a joint appointment at ethnic studies. But I sort of wanted to think about this idea of Black Brooklyn biologists, and because this gets us to how we identify in the sciences and how we see ourselves as ecologists. And for students, this may be really important of first thinking about how do people see themselves and do they identify as something. So I started out with a degree in art and medical illustration is sort of where my background was. But as my art teacher and medical illustration teacher used to say, I was way too fond of drawing dragons, so that career didn't work out very well. And I ended up on a Greyhound bus, 72 hours, from New York to Livingston, Montana, and my first job in Yellowstone National Park. Didn't even own a backpack, hadn't been outside, hadn't done any of that stuff. Since then, I was a freshman in school and left Montana 10 years later, and actually went on to graduate school to work on butterflies, went back to the Park Service, and then went back to graduate school to work with Betty on prairie dogs in Badlands National Park. So I still love to drive big trucks around and still love to go back to New York. So I maintain that identity of being from Brooklyn, being Black, and also being a biologist. And again, this issue of identity for me is very important. So what is my identity? How do I think about being an ecologist? As I said, someone who grew up in Brooklyn and in an urban landscape, so that you don't necessarily think of nature, but you think about that inquiry into nature and how that becomes part of who you are and why you want to go into a particular field. So because we're a lot of scientists on this call, probably the thing we tend to do is identify by our science and think about, you know, what is my science identity? I'm a tropical ecologist, or I study birds, I'm a birder, or I study insects. So we have a science identity that we have developed over time, and that probably intersects with your other identities. So what is my science identity? Is I study sort of 2 areas of ecological research. I like to look at pollinators, and I look at pollinators in very high elevations, which is a lot of fun in the Rocky Mountains, but also at Huscará National Park in Peru at 16,000 feet. And I like to take students out to meet pollinators and use citizen science and engaging that next generation to think about how our ecosystem works and be excited about it. And the nice thing about pollinators is they occur everywhere. So you can find these little bees in your backyard, you can find them in Huscará National Park. And this sort of interchange between pollinators and citizen science is for me very important of how I identify as a researcher. So this is my sort of my fun slide. Is I was trying to get to BB-8, but didn't quite make it because I'm also a science fiction fantasy fan. Well, Black biologist, bugger, and butterfly with backpack, binoculars, and bear spray from Brooklyn. So that's like a little bit of a mouthful, but it really becomes, you know, how I identify. I mean, a biologist, I study bugs, I look at butterflies, I usually have a backpack on, almost always have binoculars for birds. And then because I work in Yellowstone National Park, we have to carry bear spray. And I'm sure some of my students, I think maybe on the call are giggling because we actually do really need to carry bear spray and a butterfly net, and being from Brooklyn. And I think it's important that we think about how students coming into the field of ecology think about how they identify. And as people who are looking at diversity in biosciences, that identity may be even more complex. So when we talk about Black in STEM and Black identity, we have to talk about Shirley Malcolm, the current vice president of AAAS, who is very famous for her author of the book of The Double Bind. And it's about being Black in science, but it's also about being a woman of color in science. And her quote is that creating my identity in science means intersectionality, and that you cannot separate being a woman and a woman of color in the sciences. And that goes for all women of color, but she was talking from the Black perspective. And Kimberly Crenshaw later in 1989 sort of coined that term of intersectionality. And if you haven't seen her YouTube or TED Talk, it's a really great one about asking that question about intersectionality as being a woman and a woman of color in different fields, and how you cannot separate those two things into two different things. It's one, and that oneness becomes part of your identity. So why does this identity matter? You know, we're talking, our sort of conversation today and our panel later will be about the issues of diversity in the bioscientists. So I want to take a moment and just go through some hard numbers, because I think it's important that we all are speaking the same language and we're all starting from the same place. And I'm going to narrow down what we're talking about to talk about people who are underrepresented in the sciences, because then I want to tie it back to the issue of identity. And it's not to exclude, we always want to be inclusive, but I think it's important that we just sort of keep our focus to what we mean when we say underrepresented minorities in the sciences. So underrepresented minorities as defined by NSF are US citizens who identify as African American, Hispanic, Latinx is a term we use, not what the census uses, Native American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders. And the only reason why that becomes really important is to who is tracked, so that that term underrepresented means how they are underrepresented in relationship to their overall population. And in the US National Park Service, which is a federal agency, and I certainly commend the former directors of the National Park Service who would always remind us that national parks are paid for by public dollars, and they belong to everyone of the US public, which means everyone should feel comfortable visiting this national park. So we should see visitors, staff, etc., who represent the American public. But what's interesting to think about when we talk about who's represented and who's underrepresented is how we term people's identity gets complicated. Asian Americans is a great example. Asian Americans is this enormous catch-all term that includes anyone for Japan, China, India, and associated countries, some of which are developing countries and some of which are developed countries. So they technically are not considered underrepresented in the sciences, with the exception of Asian American females are considered underrepresented in the environmental sciences. And NSF and AAAS track all of these things. They track people with disabilities, but they do not track sexual orientation. So we cannot ask the question just in this context of sexual orientation, LGBTQ, because it's not currently tracked the same way. So it's not a right or wrong, it's just some who's getting tracked within one data set. And one of the goals for NSF may be that they need to track other types of underrepresentation in the future. We're working on a project on disabilities, and this is a really complicated problem on how we define people with disabilities, and then much less how we track people with disabilities to see if they are or are not underrepresented relative to their proportion in the environment. In some fields, people with disabilities are overrepresented, which is interesting. Computer science is one, relative to their proportion in the overall population within the US. So here's this report. If you haven't seen it, I'd certainly urge you to take a look. It's full of all sorts of great numbers and things to think about, but more importantly, when you try and define a strategy, it's important to know what the background is on that strategy. So to share some numbers, this is from 2013. You notice about 50% of the workforce identifies as white male. And many of you may be very familiar with these numbers, and 20% of the workforce is white female. Oops, I don't know why that decided to advance itself as white female. And everybody else lumps into the remaining 29%. But what's important when you look at that graph and then go to the next one, the overall representation of the white population is still remaining more or less around 70%, but the proportion of white women has doubled in 5 years. So this is in the sciences. So that means the proportion of white women has gone from 20 to 40% of the representation of employed scientists within the US. And again, that's looking at that underrepresented population. So if you look at the underrepresented population, I highlighted two things to think about here, especially if you look at, okay, how are we going to diversify the biosciences and who are we going after and how are we going after them? One thing to note is the red circle, not employed, but looking for work. The number of African Americans, Asian Americans is relatively high. You know, it represents almost 50% of the unemployed workforce in the sciences. So for an institution to say, well, we can't find a scientist of color, or we can't find anyone to be a mentor of color, but that's a high percentage of unemployed looking for work. So that means that population's out there. And it's important to note that, again, the Asian population is this sort of mixed bag of people, to be aware of that. And the second thing to note is, again, the Hispanic, Latinx population has the same characteristics. It's very mixed compared to the African American population, which tends to be a narrower band of heritage than Hispanic or Latin. You know, there are lots of countries that speak Spanish, and all of that gets lumped into one category within the US framework, which is problematic. But the other thing to look at is not employed and not looking. So who gets discouraged? And right now it's Asian Americans are highly discouraged, unemployed and not looking. The last column is unemployed and retired. That's a totally different set of people because it's overrepresented by white males. But it's just important to think about these numbers when we say, okay, how are we going to diversify science? We need to understand what the potential for diversifying that science is. And I think one of the realities that is really important is, number one, there are a lot of people out there looking for work in the sciences who represent people of color, and yet they're not being employed at the same rate. And when you think about that population. Okay, so a couple more numbers and we'll go back to more fun stuff. Here's a number, this is just for looking at how people are moving in the workforce. And the one thing I find that's always sort of horrifying about this graph is this is combining everybody. That means everybody, African American, Hispanic, are all combined to these numbers. And when you combine the whole mess, you'll notice that doctorate degrees for men and women doesn't even break 4% of the total workforce. So when you look at how many people have doctorate degrees in any of the science and engineering fields, since approximately the year 2000, it has barely moved by 1%. I mean, so the numbers are really bad. When you think about the Hispanic population has been increasing rapidly in the US, yet in the last 20 years, we have not been able to make a budge on the number of people of color getting doctorate degrees in the US. So what does that actually look like? And well, before I get to that, I want to sort of highlight one thing which is important to think about for this RCN. For the earth sciences, where do these people come from who are getting the degrees? And this is a fascinating graphic. So if you look at the earth sciences, 40% of people from 2013 to 2017 by field, they have an origin in the HBU system. So historically Black college and university system within the US. Now HSI are historically Hispanic surveyed institutions is a more complicated field because institutions can switch in and out of HSI status. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Florida might be really close to being HSI if it is not currently one, which means that it's only like 22%, I think, Hispanic to be HSI status. I don't know if anyone knows, but it's a messy category. Versus HBCU, specific to the universities that were founded as part of or associated with the Land Grant Act of the 1860s, 1870s, 1890s. There are about 3 different acts involved there that comprise the currently historic Black colleges and institutions, of which they represent about 10% of the total undergraduate population that gets graduated each year. Most of them are fairly small institutions. I think Howard is one of the largest, Tuskegee is about this, a little bit smaller, Lincoln, et cetera. But what's interesting to note here, of the earth sciences, 40% of all the African-American doctorates come out of that HBCU system, which represents less than 10% of the total undergraduates each year. So it means that they're highly overrepresented in the PhD world. And if you look at agricultural science, it's even higher. it's about 50%. That means that any agricultural scientist that you see who's African-American, the chance is 50% that they come out of an HBCU. That represents less than 10%. It's important to think about that. So here it gives you an idea of the numbers. In 2018, there were 763 doctorate degrees nationwide. Of all of those, 45 were Black. All of those sciences, 45 were Black. And then think about that, half come from the HBCUs. That meant 20 came from the universities represented in this RCN. And everybody else. And Colorado State, I think, had a grand total of 0. So that gives you an idea of just how bad these numbers are. This is also one of our students, and Miguel knows Tashi well. She's going to graduate next year with her PhD from Scripps Institute of Oceanography. She'll be fewer than 5 African-American PhDs in atmospheric sciences. I mean, so the numbers are that bad, that they're that skewed, that you can look at the geosciences, you can look at the natural resource sciences, and you add all of them together and you're still not breaking 100 out of several thousand degrees that are granted each year. And this is just at the PhD level. So let's get back a second to that double bind when we think about these numbers and some of the mantra that we say, okay, how are we going to diversify? What are we going to do? Do we need to have a mentor of color? Do we need to have somebody that they see that looks like them for them to enter a program? And then who is the them anyway to begin with? But the numbers are so small that we can't even separate out people from very different cultural backgrounds. Hispanic versus African-American versus Asian American, they're all lumped in the same category. And we're still not breaking 5%. So if you look at the number of, what's our potential in the next couple of years, well, but maybe if we go after some of these undergraduates now and get them interested in biodiversity and the biosciences, that we can diversify the faculty later, the numbers are really small or flat. So to give us an example from my home institution, we graduated 700 students in the last 5 years and 5 were Black. Out of 700, and 11 were Hispanic out of 700 students. So we're not even breaking 1%. So again, where is this resource coming from? Or more importantly, where is this resource going and why is it not participating? So I want to go back to identity and sort of reclaiming voice and thinking about, what does a Black ecologist look like? And sort of asking the question of where are we losing these voices? And I would like to argue that we're losing them at several places. And that we don't need to wait for, the Park Service used to be famous for saying, if we get all the 4th graders to a national park, they'll be passionate about the parks when they grow up. So President Obama, every 4th grader gets a free park pass for a year. So they'll become passionate and suddenly, ta-da, we'll get all these minority people in the park federal system. But however, if you remember that graphic, the number of minorities, of all the underrepresented minorities, that number has not shifted since 2002. We're still, since 2002, we've been wobbling around graduating somewhere between 5%. So the number has not changed. So those 4th graders have had plenty of time to grow up and to get into university and to get a degree, and they still are not there. So this is not participation. It's a real big issue that we need to think about. So I think we want to talk a little bit about this issue of reclaiming voice and just sort of thinking about how do we engage students who are currently in the general field, the general academics, and get them excited about biosciences. And I think that's an important way to think about things. So I'm going to introduce you to a project that we just got funded by the NSF, which is just getting started, but I really wanted to share our thoughts, because we did a lot of literature search on what are some of the issues that we should think about in terms of recruiting students, faculty, and others to a field that is so skewed in its diversity that it's not an issue of just saying, well, if we go out and recruit them, because they're not interested. I guess is one way to think about it. They're simply not interested. Their proportion of the population is quite high. We are not getting them in the environmental sciences. So I think there are 3 things to think about. One is the sense of identity. I started my talk with that issue of identity. Second is a sense of belonging. Do we even belong in this discipline? And third is essential in acknowledging the cultural places. And then last, which unfortunately was highlighted for all of us this May, is a sense of security. And I think I had another talk which I titled The Talk of Chris and George. If you don't know who Chris and George are, that's what happened in May, Chris Cooper and George Floyd, and think about this issue of security. So I want to talk about a brief intervention. and thinking about how we might move forward. And here's some of the mantras that we hear, and I get these all the time, and I'm sure Betty's laughing because we see, you can hear this in St. Louis all the time. Black people don't go outside, Hispanic people don't like the cold, Black people aren't exposed to nature, or they're not getting enough science, all these things about what we don't, the negative, what we don't have, you know. So, but what if we intervene in that idea of don'ts and nots and lack, and look at the self? You know, and this is great sort of theory about interventions that was published in Science in 2011, Walton Cohen, to look at how a brief intervention can change that performance of self, that also changes someone's engagement in science. And to think about science that way versus a recruitment strategy is one way to think about it. So the Voices Project, these are my colleagues, Dr. Wendy Smith, University of Minnesota, Lisa White from University of Berkeley. So you see we're all over. Chris Atkinson specialized on disability access. And then we have our social science team from San Francisco State University, Rick and Nina. And the basic idea is to take the sciences, most people in this project are geosciences, but to think differently about this issue of how do we diversify the sciences? You know, how do we diversify bioscience? And not think about it as a recruitment exercise at all, but look at it as an identity exercise. We want to create people who identify as a science. We want them to create a sense of belonging as a scientist, and we want to give them a sense of place. So what we'll just do is highlight real quickly what these three things mean. I think I talked a little bit about identity. So for me, that means, you know, I want students to still identify as a Black ecologist. I don't want them to identify as an ecologist. I want them to identify as a Black ecologist. So I want them to have that sense, that self-efficacy of being an ecologist, however that means to them, and that's really important. If they got excited about bees, they got excited about whatever. But belonging is also this issue of group, and this is where RCN's coming in. We talk about the imposter syndrome, we talk about all these things. Our numbers are so low, we can't wait to say we're going to recruit students by getting the one faculty member of color into our departments, and that person is all of a sudden going to be this magic magnet for all these students to suddenly appear in our back door who to become bioscientists. I mean, it's more complicated than that. We need to create a sense of them belonging as part of the science and thinking about how that can happen. And that belonging can often be that simple declaration like, wow, I'm really excited about diversity. I've discovered it in my backyard and now I'm ready to go out to Yellowstone National Park. But we have to allow that to be a self-identity and how those students belong in there. Because our students are all going to experience this issue of otherness because our diversity numbers are so low. You know, in our college, I'm the only African-American female in the entire college. And we used to have 2 African-American males, but one just retired. So it means there are 2 of us in the college. I have a faculty of over 100. You know, and our graduate students, 0. So the numbers are really that bad. So if we're going to recruit a student to become into ecosystem science and sustainability, they will be the other, and they will be fearful of the imposter syndrome because there'll be nobody else that looks like them. So how do we change that so it becomes something different? And also I think this is important of place, and this is especially a shout out to my Native American colleagues, that we don't pay enough attention to the importance of culture on landscapes and landscapes with culture, and how people connect to landscapes, whether it's water resources, land resources, biodiversity resources, everything connects to a landscape and a place. And then lastly, what I wanted to sort of highlight, and this is particularly for, unfortunately for African Americans, Black Lives Matters because security is an issue for us in the sciences. That this issue of security is something that when we get back to understanding identity and allowing that identity to be the richness that it represents is so important. Security is safety for many people, and it's viewed through different lenses depending on who you are. So, I mean, fairly recently, I know we have some students from my class on the call. We took students to Yellowstone National Park, and we had a caravan of vehicles going up, clearly marked Colorado State University on the side. Lead vehicle, not going fast, but for whatever reason, the police pull the caravan over in the middle of rural Wyoming. So the lead vehicle is driven by a blonde woman. The second vehicle is driven by a Hispanic woman. The police car drives past the two vehicles. Who got the ticket? That's security. Driving by black, driving by Hispanic. The policeman didn't even stop and talk to the driver of the lead vehicle. So that just happened 2 months ago. And for that Hispanic student, that was incredibly traumatic to go through. To watch that state trooper in Wyoming walk past that lead vehicle, set the pace, and give the trail vehicle a ticket. I mean, that's a powerful impact to that student. So on the day that Chris Cooper encountered Amy Cooper in Central Park, New York, as she calls the police, was the day that George Floyd was killed by the police. So what he went through is fundamentally different than anybody else who has a he for a pronoun, because he's black male, not because he was male, because he's black male. And what happened to that student in the car did not happen because she was a female driver. It was because she was an Hispanic female driver. And it's really important that we separate out those voices, especially in terms of security and safety. Where we go, where we take our students, where we're doing our biodiversity research, all of those have different lenses and different impacts on security. So just to give you a quick, this is our sort of our logic model on how we try and connect to get people into the field, to think about two things for the biosciences. This is really important. You think about the science and the careers as sort of your external motivators, and then we need to pay more attention to the internal motivators. Why do people not participate? To get to that social capital, we have to think about people internally because our numbers are so low. And this also gets back to this issue of identity. For white students in the field, they probably cannot think of a point in time, unless you take them solo to Africa and dump them at University of Nairobi or something like that, where they've been the only white student in the field. And they probably felt insecure. But for minority students, that's a daily occurrence. And it's important to think about that. And another interesting issue for us to think about is that field security, unfortunately, and also thankfully, for the action of a lot of women in academics and lawsuits and so forth, the field security has shifted from, or starting to shift, I hope, I'm being positive here, from an issue of sexual harassment in the fields to where our field classes are mostly female. So in our mountain campus, which unfortunately just burned, but the buildings seem to be okay, but the whole campus did burn, most of our classes were 70% female and 70% white female. So that has fundamentally changes the character of the field experience. And understanding that internally and externally for students who move forward is really important. And I think this is especially hard when you look at a matrix like this, and I shared the slides with Betty and feel free to share them further, because as white females, that role has suddenly changed. And this is something to celebrate, that role has changed, because you won't have a field experience. You can almost guarantee that you will not have a field experience where there will not be another female. You can almost guarantee that in everything but maybe the atmospheric sciences. But, you know, 10 years ago, that was not the case. I mean, 10 years ago, that was certainly not the case. Or it was not where you say you may have only one female out in a field crew with 10 males. When I was a firefighter way back when in Yellowstone, there were 2 females on the Yellowstone 88 fires with about 1,000 males, which led to all sorts of interesting sort of fun problems on, you know, being out in a field crew for a long period of time. But that, even in the firefighting crews, now you'll find they're running about 20 to 30% female. So that change is really fundamental and changes the whole experience. So going back to sort of finish up here, how do you increase biodiversity or diversity in the biosciences? My suggestion would be focus on the voice, not on the numbers. You have to create an identity. People have to feel like they are part of this science. And globally, and I think that was the beauty of being in Betty and John's lab. I mean, how many countries did we have in that lab? 7, 8 countries? It was a lot of different countries. So we all came to that lab with a very different perspective. And that was what celebrates us, and so many of us are still in contact to this day, even though it was 30 plus years ago that we all graduated from Missouri. And I think that's a really important issue about the voice, that we all had voice as ecologists, but we all came from different backgrounds. Celebrate being allies. I think this is super important when we're at the age of, and I would argue that we have to be careful when we think about diversity and inclusion in the same sentence, because the pathways are different for every group. I would not want to speak for my Native American colleagues on what the pathway is to engage Native Americans into the sciences. As African Americans, we need to focus on the voice. We need to focus on security. But it's different for Native Americans. And I think by diluting the message around diversity, we lose the momentum. The issue for sexual orientation is different than it is for people who are diversity, who carry multiple identities and do not separate those. So I think it's important that we just think, not a judgment one way or the other, but they're just simply not the same. White women are no longer underrepresented in the earth sciences. So the task now is to be an ally. How do you become an ally? What does it mean to be an ally versus an underrepresented group? And that allyship is so important, but it's something to celebrate, that it's not an issue of being underrepresented. So you can't, and NSF says this now, you can't go out and put in your broader impacts. I'm going to go out and recruit women because I have my PI group is all female, so therefore we can recruit more underrepresented groups. Women are not underrepresented in the earth sciences. Veterinary science is like 70% female, and psychology is like up to 80% female. These are things to celebrate, but just think about the strategy now changes. As a white female, you're no longer underrepresented, so understanding what an allyship is really different. And the intersections of identities are so important to let us be different. I'm not a white female, I'm a Black female. And we all need, I'm not Hispanic, you know, my Spanish is really bad. But I think it's so important that we separate that out so we know how each person's path comes forward. So last thing I want to just make sure I acknowledge my own amazing advisors from academics, and shout out again to Betty. We've shared lots of coffee, lots of dog stories, agility, you name it. My National Park Service leaders, Dr. Stanton, who's in the middle of the top picture, was the first African-American director of the National Park Service, and is the one who said the National Park Service must look like the face of the American public. And that's an important driving factor for what he did in the National Park Service. And then some of my colleagues, and some of you may recognize Sheldon Johnson, who's probably one of the world's top premier storytellers from the Diverse Environmental Leaders Group, that tells the story of African Americans and buffalo soldiers in Yosemite National Park, and has done sort of an amazing job to retell that story and connecting landscapes and places to cultures through Yosemite. So I think this is my last slide, and which also make sure I thank my amazing students called the Pollinator Hotshots, who have been dragged all over the world, and the support of the Lewis Stokes Alliance for Minority Participation in Science, and the Rocky Mountain Sustainability Science Network, and both of these are funded by the National Science Foundation. So with that, I think I will stop share because I can't see a chat box or questions, and I think I turn it over to Anna or Betty for questions.
Thank you so much, Gillian. That was a really great talk. I learned a lot from that talk, frankly, I really did. And I'd just like to, I'm gonna just take the prerogative here and ask the first question. I mean, you have a really good sense of what it's like to be a federal biologist in the National Park Service, as well as now being, in the academy. And I wonder if you might just talk a little bit about, just really briefly, what made you switch? I mean, you could have gone way up there in the National Park Service. What made you want to move to Colorado State University and get into the academics again?
Well, thanks for that, Betty. And actually, I don't remember if when you were at Texas, or we all got together in Texas, or with Amanda Strauss or others. But one of the things about being a federal biologist based at the university is I really enjoy the teaching. I love the teaching. And being able to reach out to students and thinking about things differently. And I still love the National Park Service. I don't think I actually left the National Park Service. This weird opportunity came up to be an assistant dean, which turned out to be a super bad idea because the dean got fired right after I got there. I think Betty knows that story. But it did open the door to opportunities, and many thanks to the National Science Foundation funded my first grant, the Rocky Mountain Sustainable Science Network, that opened up this amazing world and actually took me back to the National Park Service. Miguel was one of the first students there, and we all went to Yellowstone and other places. Now, the first year we didn't go to Yellowstone, we were mostly in Colorado, but the following years we went up to Yellowstone and Teton and national parks and reconnected the importance of basically what Bob Stanton started out with. We need to connect everybody to our national parks. So I think the other part of that opportunity was being passionate about our national parks is that I think they're in serious danger if not everybody loves them for all their glory and mistakes, etc., because they do represent our character as an American people, and parks should not be defunded without great hue and cry. Parks should be protected. They should be something that every little kid can experience. So that's part of my passion, and the ability to teach was one of the things that sort of led me back to academics. But it really was that first grant. I mean, on our, still a little bit stunned, our first try, our first go at an NSF grant, we actually got funded and so almost fell off our chairs on a 5-year grant that started the Rocky Mountain Sustainability Science Network that's still going on to this day.
Fantastic. I'm going to segue with other questions. Janine, do you want to ask your question out loud?
Sure. I have so many questions, but the one that I feel I really want to understand better is you emphasized focus on the voice. And I know you went through this in the presentation, but I feel like I didn't quite get it. I just was wondering if you could unpack again what you mean by focusing on the voice so that we really get it.
Sure. It's actually a great question. And I think part of the excitement when we put that grant together was for us all from different voices to get that aha moment. It's like, wow, that's really what we mean. So National Science Foundation just started a new program. I think it's called Sustainable Regional Ecosystems. And within it, they've actually have a new document redefining what broader impacts mean. And what I love about what they did with that was in the broader impacts, they talk about the co-production of knowledge and how do we co-produce questions of science that are important to particular communities. In other words, not just a scientist sort of parachuting into a community and say, I'm going to solve your world woes, but the community telling the scientist, this is my world woe and this is how we can work on it together. So part of voice is that co-creation of knowledge that's important to people. And I would argue that such like, if you look at the roots of urban ecology, you need to understand the urban landscape before you can ask an urban ecological question about that landscape. But we happily dive into a national park or a protected area is probably more problematic without asking the community, what is the importance for that question? A great example is, reintroduction of wolves. We as ecologists can see all these answers as to why we need to reintroduce wolves, and then we're startled when the community is not in alignment with what we're thinking about. And the second thing, which I think is more important, especially with global climate change, is climate justice and environmental justice issues. I think and we actually just got a paper accepted, yay, which we'll publish soon in Ecological Applications, is about this issue of blindness to environmental justice questions. Ecologists are great at going out and studying all sorts of crazy stuff and failing to notify a community that might have an environmental justice associated with the very process they're studying. And the last in that same thing of this voice is the lack of access to that knowledge. So Standing Rock, a great example. So Standing Rock had so many complicated ecological issues associated with it that community needed access to, and hopefully, well, I won't get into politics, if things shift around, they'll actually will go back and do the EIS that needs to be done, that was not done. But that a lot of that issues was on fisheries, subsistence hunting, and the 2 endangered species that were in the area, whereas the social media focused on water. and upstream versus downstream. So there was an ecological thing going on there that did not get addressed. And that's what the EIS was supposed to, that was what the lawsuit was about, was actually under the subsistence hunting and not under water access. So that's the issue of voice, is when the questions are co-produced, then the question has immediate use for that community. It engages students who are interested in that community. There's so many questions you could ask about New York City that would get students excited about ecology. I was I'm a kid from Brooklyn, obviously, but the other day when I was back in New York, well before the pandemic, you know, walking down the street in Brooklyn, Atlantic Avenue, and a dragonfly goes by. Now, as an ecologist, you're like, holy crap, where'd that come from? You know, most of the city kids may not have noticed it, but that was a restoration of the river landscape, the river finally being clean enough where you could actually get dragonfly larvae coming. There's all this other ecological processes that are part of that dragonfly cruising up, you know, Atlantic Avenue, and hopefully didn't get taken out by the B-28 bus that went by. But the fact that this dragonfly is an ecological process. Does that community have access to that ecological process? And think of all the little kids you could get excited with a butterfly net running up and down Atlantic Avenue to do ecology and look at biodiversity just by that one incident. So that's what I mean by voice. It's providing that voice in the context, co-creating knowledge that excites a community, gets a community engaged. And sort of last thing, oh, sorry, we're live. Last thing on the same question is that this generation of students has a voice that we don't yet use in enough, and that is their cell phones. Every cell phone is this little scientific device in their back pockets that is full of all sorts of apps that does pretty amazing things. You know, between identifying bird calls to identifying any plant and butterfly or bug out there with sometimes not the greatest accuracy, but at least it's the fact that it can do it. So how do we engage those students? Their tools are in their back pockets. So us providing them the ability to create that question wherever they are, it doesn't matter anymore because they have a cell phone. They can do all sorts of crazy things with that cell phone, and we should encourage that to get them into biodiversity and biosciences. So that was a really long answer to your question, Janine.
Thank you so much. That really helps.